Good afternoon. The hearing will come to order. I'd like to welcome today's witnesses, Mr. Irv Dennis, the Chief Financial Officer at HUD, and Mr. David Wall, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development. That's on the first panel. On the second panel, we'll hear from Mr. Jeremy Kirkland, who serves as counsel to the HUD Inspector General. So we thank you all for being here. We look forward to your testimony. HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, or CDBG-DR, is a vital tool for states and municipalities as they recover from major disasters. Grantees use flexible CDBG-DR funding to rehabilitate and reconstruct damaged housing, buy out vulnerable or damaged properties, and repair public facilities such as community centers. The activities must primarily benefit low and moderate income people in the most affected and distressed areas. Since 1993, Congress has provided more than $86 billion in supplemental appropriations for the CDBG-DR program. As the severity and frequency of storms has increased, so has the need for this kind of funding. In 2017 alone, Congress appropriated more than $35 billion for grantees recovering from major hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. To put this into perspective, HUD's entire budget in the last fiscal year was approximately $54 billion. Unfortunately, Congress has never formally authorized the CDBG-DR program. That means that for each appropriation, the Department must issue a notice in the Federal Register that outlines grantees' funding allocations, program requirements, and waivers. Without this notice, states cannot submit action plans to the Department or sign a grant agreement or begin to draw funding, necessary steps that will take at least several months after the notice is issued. Today, there are dozens of Federal Register notices governing 123 active grants for 57 grantees across the country. However, issuing Federal Register notices has taken longer in recent years. After the 2005 Gulf Coast hurricanes, HUD needed 45 days after the initial appropriation to issue the notice. After Sandy in 2012, it took 35 days. But after the 2017 hurricanes, it took 145 days. And when Congress appropriated CDBG-DR mitigation funding in February of last year, HUD didn't issue a notice until August of this year, a delay of 18 months. That's 547 days. And even then, the notice came only after Congress initiated a statutory deadline. But that's only part of the story. Rather than comply with the clear statutory language in bipartisan legislation that was signed into law by the President, HUD is withholding the required Federal Register notice for Puerto Rico. The other affected states have had to wait 18 months, which was bad enough. But Puerto Rico is still waiting. As everyone knows, the island was utterly devastated by back-to-back hurricanes. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. Tens of thousands of homes were damaged. Other committee members have visited the island. We've seen firsthand the challenges that must be overcome for a full recovery. We've seen the urgent need for this funding. And yet it has been held back, and as I understand it a few moments ago, Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney doubled down on that policy publicly in a statement he just made. HUD claims they're not comfortable moving forward due to allegations about fraud and corruption in Puerto Rico. This contradicts HUD's own certification of Puerto Rico's financial controls with respect to the CDBG-DR program. Further, what is a notice? We need to understand what a notice is. It's just an initial step in a process. HUD must review the grantee's action plan and eventually sign a grant agreement after the notice. Those serve as additional checkpoints for financial controls or other questions about grantee capacity. HUD also claims they can't move forward as they await the release of a pending Inspector General report about Vivienda, the island's housing department. Our understanding is that the IG has identified some challenges regarding procurement and staff capacity, but not widespread corruption. But in any event, the IG has not asked HUD to withhold the notice or otherwise to slow walk the funding. Procurement challenges are common among grantees. They should not be used as a pretext for punitive or prejudicial action. HUD should publish this Federal Register notice without further delay. Just as concerning are reports that the HUD Inspector General is facing ongoing challenges accessing information, including emails and interviews with HUD staff, as part of their investigation into whether HUD has slowed the disbursement of funds to Puerto Rico. If true, this is completely unacceptable, and it must be corrected. We look forward to hearing directly from the IG later this afternoon. Of course, the CDBG-DR program is bigger than just Puerto Rico, although Puerto Rico has clearly been singled out. Many states, including my home state of North Carolina, are implementing action plans or awaiting additional notices from HUD to tap into disaster funding that was appropriated last year and in June of this year. Meanwhile, both the HUD, IG, and GAO have raised important questions about HUD's internal capacity, staffing, and oversight of the CDBG-DR program. I look forward to a robust discussion of these topics, which will continue to be a major focus for this subcommittee. Finally, I want to mention that this is the first CDBG-DR hearing we've had since the retirement of Stan Guimont, the longtime HUD staffer who many of us consider the foremost expert on this program. His retirement is a loss to HUD and to the country, but we certainly wish him well in the next chapter. We welcome Tenille Smith Parker, who is stepping up as Stan's replacement. The career staff at HUD do outstanding work, and we thank them for their service. Now, I'd like to recognize the distinguished ranking member, my friend and partner, Mr. Diaz-Balart, for any opening remarks he might want to make.
Chairman Price, thank you again for holding this important hearing, and I also would like to welcome our witnesses, Dr. Wall and Mr. Dennis. Our witnesses today are charged with the oversight of the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. This program is critically important to places like Puerto Rico, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and so many other states and jurisdictions that have been hit by devastating storms and floods in the recent years. I am particularly proud of the work that Chairman Price and I did with every member of this subcommittee to respond to the three 2017 hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, that caused such terrible damage. And again in 2018, Mr. Chairman, hurricanes hit our home states rather hard. Hurricane Michael in the Panhandle and Hurricane Florence in North Carolina. Our communities continue to work to recover from these storms. And in fact, the long-term recovery from these storms has just begun in these states and the territories. The enormous damage caused by the 2017 storms led this committee to set a new priority on investments to make communities more resilient. This is something that was done and begun in this subcommittee. And that's why we established the CDBG mitigation programs to help strengthen our nation against future disasters, those disasters that we know, unfortunately, right, are going to come again. I'm confident that this program will protect lives and property when those future storms inevitably hit. This will ultimately also reduce the burden to the taxpayers as houses and public infrastructure and businesses are able to better withstand the onslaught of hurricanes, floods, and wildfires and the such. But we all must be aware that standing up a major new program is clearly not a small task. And this is a new program that has been generously funded. A successful mitigation program will require vision, innovation, and oversight by HUD leadership. And it will also require significant coordination with other federal agencies. But, really most importantly, it will require that the state and the territorial officials who are charged with executing this new program have the skills and the workforce to get the job done, right, and to make sure that taxpayer money is well protected. So while CDBG-DR provides vital long-term recovery resources to our states and territories, the program is characterized by frankly, major delays to the lack of an authorization and codified regulations, something that all of us have talked about for such a long time. This is something that Congress and the administration must work together to solve. And I hope we can discuss some potential solutions to this challenge today. And I know, Mr. Chairman, that there's legislation out there that both you and I have had an opportunity to kind of look at, and I think there's a lot of promise with that legislation. Finally, I would also like to express my concern that HUD missed the statutory deadline for publishing the mitigation notice for Puerto Rico. Look, I understand that there may be factors outside of our witnesses' control that led to this missed deadline, but I'm troubled. I'm always troubled, and I don't care which administration may do it when any administration doesn't meet requirements set in statute. And I, of course, have a special concern when it is a requirement of the Appropriations Committee in the appropriations bills. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for being here with us today, for the job that you do, you and the team that day in, day out do such important work for our country, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We're now pleased to be joined by the chairwoman of the full House Appropriations Committee, Representative Lowy, and happy to recognize her.
And I'd like to thank my friends Chairman Price and Ranking Member Diaz-Balart for holding this hearing today. Mr. Dennis and Mr. Wall, we hope you can shed light today on what appears to be perpetual stonewalling by HUD and Secretary Carson in your responsibility to assist Americans whose lives have been devastated by natural disasters. Hurricane Maria destroyed homes, businesses, and public infrastructure in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands into September of 2017. Yet grantees in those areas still have not received funds appropriated by Congress as early as February of 2018, because the administration has not yet executed grant agreements or has failed to even issue required notices. On April 1st, Secretary Carson gave this subcommittee his word that notices for mitigation funding for potential CDBG DR grantees would be issued by May 1st. HUD missed the deadline. But Congress passed the additional supplemental appropriations for disaster relief Act of 2019 in May on a bipartisan basis to provide an additional $331 million to address unmet recovery needs for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. The President signed this bill into law on June 6th, requiring HUD to publish all notices for mitigation funding included in this bill as well as prior spending bills by September 4th, 2019. No caveats, no carve-outs, no exemptions. HUD barely made that deadline, but missed Secretary Carson's self-imposed deadline of May 1st by a long shot, with notices for various disasters on August 30th, followed by a notice for the Virgin Islands on September 4th. Yet, as we sit here today, the notice for Puerto Rico still has not been issued. American communities have been waiting far too long for the relief and recovery assistance they deserve. Any further delay by HUD to facilitate CDBG-DR funds to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, it's not just unacceptable, it is unlawful. I hope you will take these concerns and your duties seriously by contributing to a productive discussion today and by doing your jobs to help Americans in need. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Wall, you're now recognized for your 5-minute opening statement. Any elaboration of the statement or further material you wish will be inserted in the record.
and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for welcoming us today to discuss HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. By way of introduction, prior to joining HUD, I served as a federal prosecutor and later as the director of New Jersey's Superstorm Sandy Compliance Unit, which safeguarded billions of dollars in federal funds for disaster recovery. I'm honored to be joined today by HUD's Chief Financial Officer, Irv Dennis, whose impressive background includes a 37-year career as a partner with Ernst & Young, where he advised public company boards, audit committees, and top executives at large institutions, many of whom had to navigate crisis conditions of their own. HUD is currently administering a disaster recovery portfolio of $55 billion in active grants, with projects dating back to the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. But contrary to popular belief, HUD is not in the immediate disaster response business. That work is performed by FEMA and SBA. Instead, HUD is focused on long-term recovery. That recovery process begins when you and your colleagues in Congress appropriate CDBG-DR funds. Based on unmet needs assessed from FEMA and SBA data for presidentially declared major disasters, HUD allocates those funds to the most impacted and distressed areas. Following the public announcement of allocations, HUD publishes a Federal Register notice outlining the framework of program requirements. Grantees then develop stakeholder-informed action plans and certify their capacity to manage the funds. HUD reviews and approves these plans and monitors the grantees for compliance. The group of 2017 disaster grantees consisted of California, Florida, Georgia, Missouri, Texas, and the USVI, as well as Puerto Rico. To address their unmet needs, Congress appropriated a total of $19.4 billion in two separate tranches of funding. The first supplemental appropriations bill contained $7.4 billion and was allocated to Florida, Puerto Rico, Texas, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. That tranche is now fully available to those grantees, which to date have spent a combined total of $123 million, or just 2% of those funds. The second supplemental appropriation for the unmet needs of the 2017 class totaled $12 billion. Of that amount, a combined total of $1 billion is currently available to grantees in California, Florida, Georgia, Missouri, and Texas. Action plans for Puerto Rico and the USVI have been approved by HUD, and funds will be released to these grantees pending execution of grant agreements. In 2017, for the first time in the history of HUD's administration of disaster recovery programs, Congress provided mitigation funds as part of a CDBG-DR appropriation. Mitigation funds were appropriated not only for the 2017 grantees, but also for those receiving funds from disasters in 2015 and 2016. HUD has never before administered a standalone mitigation program. Standing up this new program has taken time, but we believe it is time well spent, given the historic size of the appropriation and the fact that every grantee awaiting mitigation funds already has access to funding for unmet needs. Mr. Chairman, we certainly want to acknowledge that the primary reason we are here today is because Congress directed us to publish the mitigation notice by September 4th. I want to assure you that we take congressional deadlines seriously, and we were able to meet the September 4 deadline for 17 of the 18 grantees. However, in the case of the largest grantee, Puerto Rico, that work continues. Our choice, quite simply, was whether to come before you today to explain why we did not meet the deadline, but hopefully safeguarded the funds, or come before you a year from now to explain why we released billions of dollars that were wasted and never reached the people of Puerto Rico. All of us at HUD stand shoulder to shoulder with the people of Puerto Rico. Senior HUD leadership, including Secretary Carson, our Deputy Secretary, and both Irv and I, along with our dedicated career staff, have visited Puerto Rico multiple times to meet with the Commonwealth's political leadership and with officials at Vivienda. Our partnership is strong, and we are actively engaged with Vivienda to establish financial controls, policies, and procedures that will protect taxpayer dollars and ensure the recovery of the people of Puerto Rico. We will also soon be announcing the appointment of a federal financial monitor in San Juan to oversee the disbursement of disaster recovery dollars to Puerto Rico. Mr. Chairman, natural disasters do not just devastate housing capital, they devastate human capital through lives lost or interrupted, school days missed, and communities fragmented under enormous strain. At HUD, we are committed to the recovery of all Americans whose homes and communities were devastated by natural disasters, and we are steadfast in our stewardship of the funding entrusted us by you and your colleagues in Congress. Thank you for the opportunity to update the subcommittee on HUD's disaster recovery work.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll now turn to questions, and I'll start with a brief recounting of what brought us to this point. On February 9th, 2018, the President signed the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. That act included $28 billion in community development block grant disaster recovery funding. Of that amount, no less than $12 billion was for mitigation funding. Neither Puerto Rico nor the Virgin Islands have had access to any of the funding from this act. Secretary Carson testified before this subcommittee in April, and he said the mitigation notice for the notice for the mitigation funding would be issued on or before May 1st. May 1st came and went, no notice. Frustrated by HUD's pace providing assistance to individuals and communities in need, Congress included a provision in the June supplemental appropriations bill that required the Secretary to issue the mitigation notice within 90 days. The 90 days expired on September 4th. HUD issued mitigation notices for all grantees except Puerto Rico. Now, gentlemen, the administration has a duty to faithfully execute the law. Why didn't HUD follow the law, issue the Federal Register notice for mitigation funding for Puerto Rico?
Mr. Chairman, we were able to meet your deadline with respect to 17 of the 18 grantees and the U.S. Virgin Islands. But after the deadline was set in June, there were a number of troubling events in Puerto Rico that caused everyone concern. In July, there was a Puerto Rican cabinet secretary and high government official who were indicted for procurement fraud. And procurement fraud is always one of our chief concerns. In July and August, there were hundreds of thousands of people on the street demanding the governor's resignation. In less than 1 week in August, Puerto Rico had 3 different governors. No one was certain who the governor was going to be or how that would affect Vivienda, who's our main partner, our grantee. Even before the hurricanes, Puerto Rico declared bankruptcy because of financial mismanagement. And in addition, we also knew of an impending IG audit, and we recently reviewed an IG audit around Puerto Rico's capacity to manage these funds, which was of concern to us. Given that troubling sequence of events, we thought it was the most prudent course was not to rush the money out. And as I mentioned in the opening remarks, I believe we had a difficult choice to make. Protect the funds and come before you today to explain missing the deadline, or come before you in a year to explain why we released billions of dollars in funds that were wasted and did not go to the people who needed it the most, which is the people of Puerto Rico.
Well, with due respect, I think you're posing a false choice, and I'll explain why I think that. But, you know, with respect to obeying the law, shouldn't be a difficult choice, should it?
Well, we thought it was a difficult choice in this instance because of the events that happened in August.
You have the option of ignoring the law because of an array of alleged troubles in Puerto Rico. 3 governors, for example, that justifies your breaking the law.
With respect to the 3 governors, our concern was that...
I know you have concerns. These concerns are legitimate. The question is, A, does that justify breaking the law in your case, a very clear directive? And B, what is this notion that the issuance of the notice is the only checkpoint you have? I mean, of course we want to see any difficulties in Puerto Rico examined. We're going to be hearing from the Inspector General about the work, her office about the work she's doing. We want to address these issues. That is not the issue. The issue is why you are holding up the mitigation notice in violation of the law. The mitigation notice isn't the sole checkpoint. The law contemplates a multi-step approach. You're required to have this notice in place by September 4th. There's then the formulation of an action plan. You then review and approve the action plan, right? That's a checkpoint. You then execute a grant agreement. That's a checkpoint. The law explicitly states that with respect to the mitigation funds, then the Secretary needs to recertify the grantee's financial control proficiency before making a grant. So you have plenty of opportunity to do that. Why not the notice when the law requires you to issue the notice? Why is that some kind of unique choke point that you're bound to use as a way of denying these much-needed funds? I just don't get that argument.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we view the mitigation notice, the action plan, and the grant agreement as interdependent. As you know, the notice sets out sort of the rules of the road for the action plan, and we wanted to reference controls, the important financial controls that we thought were essential in the actual notice to inform Puerto Rico's action plan. We hope that the grant agreement will then buttress both the notice and the action plan. And we wanted to pursue, hopefully, this boots and suspenders approach that is transparent to the public because everyone can see exactly what's required of the grantees. Puerto Rico is a very high-risk grantee because of the amount of money involved. It's far more than double what Louisiana received following Hurricanes Katrina, Wilma, and Rita. It's roughly 26% of all disaster recovery funds that have been granted since 2001. It's a lot of money. And on top of that, Puerto Rico has had issues with procurement and other issues around financial controls. We want to have a belts and suspenders plan in place to make sure that, A, we're protecting taxpayers, but B, more importantly, that the money is going to the people of Puerto Rico and not being wasted or abused.
What was your statutory authority to not obey the law and issue this notice?
What we wanted to do is be in front of you today, sir, explaining
What is the statutory authority?
There is no statutory authority, sir. We wanted to come before you today and explain why we didn't meet the deadline as opposed to coming to you later and explaining to you why billions of dollars were lost and not spent on the people of Puerto Rico and instead were spent on procurement fraud.
Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wall, in being contacted by the Honorable Gonzalez Colon's office, I want to ask the following question. In your written testimony, you mentioned that there are concerns from HUD regarding Puerto Rico seeking relief under Title III of the PROMESA Act, which established the Financial Oversight and Management Board. And so could you please elaborate on those concerns, since it is my understanding that the board handles state funds exclusively? So why should these concerns be tied to the management of federal disaster recovery assistance from HUD? Or am I incorrect there?
Yeah, I think the view on that, when you take a risk assessment of any entity, and we'll call Commonwealth an entity in this case, Vivienda is part of that entity, and you take a look at the corporate governance of it all. Even though money's going right to Vivienda, we're working closely with them, and we have a good collaborative relationship with them, and they're trying to do the right thing. They want to do the right thing for sure. We're seeing that. There are other entities involved. The money's going to flow through Vivienda. It's going to flow through subgrantees, other governmental entities. So we're not looking at Vivienda in isolation. When you do a risk assessment of any entity, you look at the corporate governance of it all, not just a particular part. So that's really why we're focused on that.
All right, and I think it's important for us to understand just the enormous challenge faced by Puerto Rico. You mentioned the amount of money, and it's frankly a huge amount of money. But the challenge faced by Puerto Rico in executing the CDBG-DR funds provided from Hurricane Maria. So can you break down where we stand with the $19.9 billion that has been allocated to Puerto Rico, and how much of that has actually been spent to date?
I can respond to that. Puerto Rico currently has available $1.5 billion in funds. To date, they've spent less than 1% of that amount. That's not atypical. It took New Jersey roughly 2 years to spend $1.5 billion. So that's not, but they do have plenty of money available to meet unmet need. We recently approved another grant agreement for an additional pot of money for Puerto Rico, and we're preparing grant agreements as we speak and hope to have that money obligated soon. We also are working very, very hard on Puerto Rico's mitigation notice. We feel like it's been an interagency review. We feel like we've had significant breakthroughs and that we're getting very close there as well. And finally, with respect to the $1.9 billion for an electric power grid, we're working very closely with our federal partners in terms of the best way to spend that money. We are not in the power business. It's not our expertise. And so we've been working very closely with FEMA, who's already made a substantial billions of dollars of investment in Puerto Rico's power grid, as well as the experts at DOE. And so we're going to stand shoulder to shoulder with them and work with Puerto Rico in getting a very good electric grid system for them.
The success of the mitigation program depends on how well the efforts are coordinated with other federal agencies, obviously. And so can you describe a little bit of the process that HUD undertook with other federal agencies to develop the mitigation, the Federal Registry Notice? Will other agencies contribute to the review of the state and the territory's mitigation action plans?
Yeah, absolutely. What we don't want to do is act in a silo on mitigation. It's just too important that we get it right. It's a really large allocation that we hope will lead to really long-term recovery and actually protection from states. So we want bold projects that aren't just going to affect next year, but will be in place 10 to 15 years down the line. So we had multiple meetings with FEMA, at least 4 in-person meetings, many phone calls. We received input and advice from DOE, from the Army Corps, and from SBA. This was a really long process. Our career staff, which I call the best in the building, did a fantastic job in drafting a mitigation notice I think that we're all very proud of, and we hope that it satisfies Congress.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm running out of time, and I have a lot of other questions, but I'll wait for the next round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Loy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dennis, Mr. Wall, you say in your testimony that HUD is investing time and expertise into helping, thank you, Puerto Rico build a strong recovery. Could you share with us what specifically have you asked of the Puerto Rico Department of Housing that they have not done? And I'd like both of you to respond.
Well, we have a very good partnership with Vivienda, and we work very closely with them. They have available to them $1.5 billion in funds right now. They've spent less than 1% of that money, so they have a lot of money available for unmet need. As with any other grantee, what we're mostly worried about is we take an objective assessment of what the risk is, and we require controls to be in place around those risks. We've worked very closely and provided a lot of technical assistance to Puerto Rico in terms of developing their systems, making sure that they have proper staffing. It takes a long time. This is a Commonwealth that manages $23 million in CDBG funds, and all of a sudden they have $1.5 billion that they're trying to manage. So it's a big step up, and so we've been helping them. But like a lot of other grantees, they sometimes struggle with systems and with staffing. But again, we spend a lot of time helping them and working with them, and we're in constant communication with them.
Can you be more specific? I'd really like to know what the problem is here. What have you asked of the Department of Housing that they have not done? It seems to me there's a lot of money out there. Can you be more specific? And I just want to say one other thing, because we all understand that Puerto Rico has experienced political changes, but How has that situation impacted your ability to work with the Puerto Rico Department of Housing?
You know, the Department of Housing has never handled DR money before. This is $20 billion, and when you think of $20 billion going through an entity that has no infrastructure for that, that does not get developed overnight. When you think of the capacity they need people, they need processes, and they need technology. None of those did they have on day one. We've been working very closely with them. They're doing a great job of developing that, but as we sit here today, they don't have all the people they need. Their IT systems aren't up fully functional, and their policy procedures are not completely written. And one of the things that we are looking at within DR in general, not specific to Puerto Rico, but something I brought my thinking, my 37 years experience, is to not only look at the controls at Vivienda, but look at the controls and the oversight at the subrecipients and the subgrantees. When you look at prior IG reports, there is a lot of misuse of those funds and improper payments at those sub-levels. And what we're trying to make sure is that there is good oversight and controls and policies in place. So when it leaves the grantee, even though they may have great procedures, what is the control and oversight at the subrecipient, the subgrantee, and ultimately it gets paid? That is not completely built out. They're doing a great job. We're working well with them. They are receptive to what we're talking about. I've been down there 3 or 4 times, and my team's been down there 7 times. Dave's team's been down there several times. So it's not what they're not doing. It's just they're not quite ready to take $20 billion and flush it through the system. And they have $1.5 billion. That's helping them get up and running. They spent a little over $2 million, or less than 1%, whatever the math is. So there is money down there for them to spend. This is not holding them up from what they're doing. But having that infrastructure on to process $20 billion is absolutely critical to make sure that's in place properly.
So explain to me what HUD can do or should do in a situation where the need is really quite extraordinary, correct?
Absolutely, the need
I
is
know you go back
extraordinary.
to your offices and you say they're not doing it. What can you do differently?
They do have access, as I said, to the $1.5 billion. And one of the things that we also are concerned about, that Irv has mentioned many times, is we are worried about how their oversight of subrecipients, because just given our experience with disaster recovery and my experience with Sandy, is a lot of the problems may come on the procurement side, particularly with subrecipients. And so we want to also make sure that, you know, Vivienda has worked very well with us. We have a wonderful partnership with them. They're very receptive to everything that we've asked, but it's not just Vivienda in a vacuum. We have to work with, the reality that they face, which is this money going out to subrecipients, and that typically is where you get a lot of the problems with fraud, waste, and abuse.
So what can we do differently?
Yeah,
We
I-
all agree the need is great. You're saying they can't get it done because they can't handle that much money. How many people do you have working for you?
Look, I think your question's a good one.
Could you just answer that?
Working for, there's like what, how many people do you have in your staff? About 25?
For disaster recovery, we're going to be doubling in size. We're going to have close to 50, hopefully by the end of the calendar year.
So is there any way that you can provide some additional leadership so this money can be spent effectively? I just don't understand it. The need is great. Obviously, you're saying, am I finished? Yes, I'm finished. We'll turn, maybe you can clarify, maybe you can just clarify, and then we'll turn to the next person.
Look, I think your question's a good one. I came aboard on January 18th. Dave is new, and one of the things we're thinking about is how can we do this better for any grantee or state that needs help up front as opposed to waiting later on? We're thinking of different ways and processes that we can do to help, like a Vivienda, kind of jumpstart their thinking and give them tools and upfront earlier in the process so it doesn't take so long to build out the infrastructure. We haven't put that in place yet, but it's something that's on our agenda that we want to think about as we go forward. And, $40 billion over the last couple of years, this money came at us quick, it came at us fast, and it's going out to the states quickly. And quite frankly, prior to this administration, we don't have all of the infrastructure we need in CPD. We are doubling the staff. That doesn't happen overnight with the hiring rules within the government. So this is taking time to get where we need to be to even administer the funds that we have.
Mr. Womack.
I guess I've used up my time, but I gather it's not just, Mr. Chairman, it's not just the administrators there. You're saying you don't have adequate skilled staff to administer it from your office. Is that what we just heard?
No, we have the adequate skills. We are looking to increase our head count.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Womack.
I thank the chairman. Well, it's obvious. We have a disaster. The federal government has a response, and we all want to see money flow to the people that need it the most. So I'm going to ask, you've already touched on, Mr. Wall, a little bit about why you're here instead of here a year later on in a totally different way, trying to explain something bad. You're probably taking the lesser of the two evils, i.e., if I'm hearing you correctly, and don't let me put words in your mouth, that your concern was money flowing out when it's really not ready. And there are great concerns about a climate in a devastated area that is known and rife with all kinds of potential corruption and opportunities for taxpayer money. I think the people in my district that I represent would want to make sure that if we're sending taxpayer money out to help people, that it's going to the right people for the right purpose and it's properly accounted for. Is that an accurate way to portray your decision to delay rather than just get money flowing out there and have to come back later and explain why it ended up in the wrong hands or for the wrong purposes?
That's exactly right.
So how bad could it have been? Let's fast forward a year. Let's say that the money flowed, that you dismissed your own concerns, and instead you just hit go. How bad could this have been?
Well, there's always potential for fraud, and I should say not just fraud coming from people within Puerto Rico, but when you have that much money, you have a big target on your back. There would be people coming to try to take your money away from you and not spend it on the people who the money's intended for. So that's always a concern. But of particular concern is always procurement fraud. And in July, as I said, there was an indictment in Puerto Rico involving a cabinet secretary and another high official who were steering money in a procurement. And that's money that will never be recovered. It's gone. It's with CDBG, we could potentially make up the money through subsequent allocations, but with respect to the disaster, because it's a one-time deal, that money's lost forever, and people of Puerto Rico will never have that money. It belongs to them, and we want to make sure that we get out enough money that they can satisfy their unmet need. But we also have to be prudent and careful, and we have to think about your constituents and other taxpayers and what they want us to do with that money and to safeguard that money. So
generally speaking, what are some of the worst-case scenarios that could happen, aside from Puerto Rico, without being specific to a devastated area? What are some of the things what are the lessons that we've learned in the past that basically kind of champion the path for the future, that we want to make sure that we've learned this lesson, we don't go down this path, we learn from history, and we actually make all the right calculated decisions, get the money in the right hands, and properly accounted for? What would that be?
So when you look at prior IG reports, you notice deficiencies in the various parts of the complete flow of funds. And the complete flow of funds is Treasury to the grantee, to the sub-grantee, sub-recipient on out. There are IG reports that would suggest there are deficiencies at the grantee level in that oversight of the sub-grantee and sub-recipients. So what could happen there? There could be conflicts of interest in procurement. Money could get in the wrong hands. There could be money paid for services that aren't performed. There could be duplicate payments. And all that gets very complicated when you're flowing that through to the people that are in need. So that's why it's so important that these grantees have the right infrastructure of people, process, and technology to make sure that the procurement is done right, it's done in accordance with federal law, to make sure there's no improper payments, to make sure there's no conflicts. It's a complicated process, and in Vivienda's case, you're starting with a clean sheet of paper. None of this has happened before. They don't have an infrastructure in place on day one. It takes a while to build that out.
So if the worst situation happened, how tough is it to claw back the money?
It's very hard. It's
Very hard.
And if it was stolen, it's
Next to
it's gone.
impossible, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct. And Irv is talking about putting the processes in place, and on top of that, you need to have monitoring, and that's why, in addition to having a dedicated staff down there to do monitoring, the Secretary hopes to announce soon the appointment of a federal financial monitor, who actually will give everybody more comfort that the money is being safeguarded and spent on the people who need it the most. As the Secretary says, the people in need, not the people with greed. So.
Absolutely. I yield back.
Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for joining us, but I have to say I'm getting a little confused on the thread of your argument here. So if I understand you, and according to the comments within the last few hours from Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, this administration did not want to give aid to Puerto Rico because they thought it was corrupt. Is that correct?
The long-term recovery of both the administration and HUD the long-term recovery of Puerto Rico is the top priority.
Is that a yes or a no?
Well, we want the money to go to the people of Puerto Rico and certainly not through corruption. We don't want it wasted through procurement
So the
fraud.
decision not to file the notice by the September 4th deadline was because of corruption, though. Is that correct? That was your testimony earlier?
There were a number of troubling events that happened in August, in addition to prior financial mismanagement issues in Puerto Rico that led us to believe that the more prudent course of action was to make sure that we had proper controls in place so that we could better ensure that the money is spent properly and spent on the people of Puerto Rico.
Let's back up for a minute here. So during the gubernatorial changes, no key official at Vivienda, which is the Department of Housing, changed, correct? Secretary Gill was the same official through all three governors. Is that correct?
Yes, he's currently the secretary, yes, ma'am.
And there were no indictments issued involving Department of Housing in Puerto Rico. It was the Department of Education. Is that correct?
That's correct, but there actually was a news story about Secretary Gill being approached by someone concerning a procurement, and it was an improper contact that Secretary Gill
So
immediately...
is that why the notice wasn't? This
No.
adjacent news story about Secretary Gill?
No, but it's an ongoing problem down there with procurement. Secretary Gill did the honorable thing, and he's an honorable person, but
Okay.
it's an ongoing problem down there.
Okay, so we
making
have an
sure-
honorable head of housing.
That's correct.
And you have $1.5 billion that's gone to Puerto Rico.
That's correct.
There is a process, right? First, we have the federal register notice, then you have an initial action plan, and then you have grant agreements. So your testimony today is that in Puerto Rico, desperately in need of aid, you did not meet the requirement, the legal requirement to file this notice by September 4th because of corruption, fear of money going to the greedy, not the needy. But this is the beginning. The notice is the beginning. That is not distributing additional funds.
The notice is the rules of the road, though, and the notice informs the action
And the
plan.
rules of the road were a requirement of filing by September 4th. Who told you? Did this come from Secretary Carson? Did this come from Mick Mulvaney, as he indicated in his recent conference?
We were all concerned at HUD, and we were all concerned about the troubling events that happened both in July and August. And again, I think
So have
we
there
were-
been passbacks with OMB? On whose desk did this stop and say, we are not going to comply with the law around issuing this notice because we are concerned about corruption?
We had multiple meetings at HUD around the events that were happening in July and
With
August,
whom?
including within HUD. We had, with our senior leadership
So
team,
this
we were
was
meeting.
just done within HUD senior leadership. This was your decision.
It was a HUD decision based on the number of indicia that we saw of potential problems that we We wanted to stop and wanted to make sure that we got this right, that we didn't rush something out the door, we didn't rush billions of dollars out the door that we couldn't protect.
So do you
Now,
think those concerns about so-called rushing billions of dollars out the door, which we're at the beginning of the process, filing the Federal Register notice, I don't understand how those two things square and why you thought these concerns allowed you to not meet your legal requirements?
Well, Puerto Rico currently has access to $1.5 billion. They've spent less than 1% of that money.
How
They
does
have-
that change your legal requirement to file this notice in a timely way?
Well, again, I think we had a choice to make whether we wanted to come before you and explain to you today why we didn't meet the deadline, as opposed to rushing money out the door that we didn't think that they were in.
Again, Mr. Wohl, that wasn't the choice that you made. Your choice was not to file the basic mitigation notice by September 4th. This is not the release of money on September 4th.
Well, again, the mitigation notice, the action plan, and the subsequent grant agreement are interdependent, so.
They're
we want-
interdependent, but they're not, I mean, the September 4th deadline, I failed to understand from any of your testimony today why that was not met.
We had concerns about how the money would be spent. We had concerns of making sure that we had
So your
controls in
concerns
place.
about corruption, you decided put you above the law, and you would just do this on a different time frame.
It wasn't just corruption, it was concerns about having proper processes and controls in place so that we could make sure
my
that the
time has
money went to the right
expired.
people.
Thank you. Ms. Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for bringing this meeting together. Thank you also, Mr. Wohl, for your kind words regarding the department's commitment to the recovery of Puerto Rico. I hope that we can get to the bottom of why the department's actions are not in line with those words that you just stated. It's my understanding today that White House Chief of Staff Mulvaney stated that Puerto Rico is not a foreign country, and that this comparison is extremely offensive. Do you agree with that?
Our commitment at HUD is to work closely and collaboratively.
Do you agree that Puerto Rico is not a foreign country?
Puerto Rico is part of the United States. Everybody in Puerto Rico
Yes
is
or
a
no?
United States
Puerto Rico is
citizen.
not a foreign country, correct?
It's part of the United States, ma'am. They're fellow citizens.
So there's been a lot of back and forth as to the inability of providing truthful information to Congress in the notice. You've talked a lot about public corruption. So let's talk about public corruption. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce a document to the record. The document is a letter from the Office of Inspector General. Mr. Chairman? Without objection, I'd like to
I'm sorry.
introduce a letter from the Office of Inspector General.
Certainly, without objection.
This document, I want to read the first paragraph of this letter. It says, "I am writing to express my concern that department officials provided inaccurate information to congressional committee staff about my communications to you regarding the Office of Inspector General. Review of Vivienda's capacity to administer CDBG funds appropriated for disaster relief to Puerto Rico." The memo goes on to say that department officials lied to congressional committee staff when they claimed that the IG told them the capacity review would have serious or significant findings. The IG is quite clear that no specific actions were recommended and that the review is ongoing. Furthermore, that it was made explicit to department leadership that the IG's audit team had not yet prepared draft findings to share with the department. So, Mr. Wohl, this memo makes it very clear that department officials engage in fairly clumsy attempt to intentionally mislead Congress. It also begs the question that if the capacity review did not justify delaying the publication of the notice, and if that is not, then what did? Is the department looking into why officials lied to Congress staff in respect to the IG's conclusions in the capacity review? And has there been any interference from the White House or OMB that led to the department's decision to delay the publication of this notice?
Well, first of all, ma'am, it's a bit perplexing because as Irva and I sit here today, we're unaware of anybody at HUD suggesting that the IG directed us not to meet the deadline or to withhold the mitigation notice. What did happen is that the IG informed us sometime in late August, while everything else was going on, that it would soon have an audit report available concerning Puerto Rico's capacity to manage these funds. We thought that that audit would be obviously very relevant to the work we were doing and the
So
controls
you're
that we
being
were trying to-
repetitive right now, and I asked you specific questions about, has there been an investigation as to why your department lied to members of Congress, the staff?
I'm unaware of anybody from the department lying to Congress about the
Are you aware of
Inspector
the
General
letter?
report.
Are you aware of the letter from the Office of Inspector General?
I'm aware of the general statement that we somehow we relied on them to say that we shouldn't issue the notice, and I don't recall anybody ever saying that. So I'm perplexed by the letter. I'm perplexed by that was ever done. What we did was we said that and we've had a chance now to look at the audit report, and we do have concerns about the audit report that we saw. But all we knew in August was that there was a report coming out that it was going to be about Puerto Rico's capacity, an issue that we were looking at very closely at the
So all those
time.
concerns that you've laid out for members of Congress regarding, using your words, public corruption, why didn't you share that with members of Congress or with the staff?
Concerns went beyond public corruption. I mean, there were a number of things going on. As you said, we had 3 different governors in 1 week. We weren't sure. It worked out well where we ended
Why
up
didn't you
having.
share that with the committee staff? And are you saying that the IG is lying in the letter that they wrote?
Certainly not. I'm just
Okay.
perplexed because I'm unaware of anyone at HUD saying that the reason we weren't going to meet the September 4 deadline is because the IG told us that. That was never the case. We were dealing with multiple things happening at the same time in Puerto Rico and a number of concerns all happening at the same time. It was an inopportune time for it to happen. It
My
was in
staff,
August.
my time has expired, and I would like something in writing to you as to what you have done to investigate this lying issue to members of our staff.
And again, ma'am, I'm unaware of anybody lying.
Mr. Aguilar?
So you talked as part of your rationale. I'm trying to put a finer point on this and to understand it. Your argument is 3 governors, potential corruption in the Department of Education, and what are the other reasons why you didn't meet the statutory deadline?
Well, I mean, there's obviously been issues with financial management with respect to Puerto Rico going back even before the hurricane. I mean, the hurricanes, Puerto Rico, obviously filed for bankruptcy, and they've had financial mismanagement issues in the past. All of this was happening when we're talking about the deadline and missing the deadline. All of this was happening as we're approaching the deadline, and it did cause us concern because when you have hundreds of thousands of people in the street asking for the governor to resign, you have uncertainty, certainly at
Did
that
any-
time, as who's going to be the head of
Did any
Vivienda.
staff change at Vivienda?
Not that I'm aware of. Thankfully,
So no-
they're still our partners, and we still work collaboratively with
No
them.
key staff changes. Look, there's gubernatorial elections all over. There's issues all over. Aren't there, are you aware of any other localities where federal or state officials have gone in? Other cities? I know of cities in California and in other states where the feds are looking at different issues. And so I guess I'm just trying to understand why you felt these were the basis, or collectively these, because I'll tell you what it looks like. What it looks like is that you don't believe that these individuals deserve this money. that these individuals deserve access to disaster recovery dollars. Based on what you're saying, you feel they deserve 1.5 billion, and they can be trusted with 1.5 billion, maybe, but they don't deserve access to any more.
That's just not true. I mean, we're working extremely hard right now to get Puerto Rico the rest of their money.
Okay, great,
Congress appropriated that money.
Okay, great.
And it would take
Can
an
you
act
tell-
of Congress
can you
for
tell
us
me-
not to give them that money.
Well, it took an act of Congress. We gave you a statutory deadline, so clearly acts of Congress aren't really your jam. So I guess what I'm asking is, if you want them to be successful.
We do.
Okay, good. What technical assistance have you offered them in order to meet these deadlines? What technical assistance, how many people have you offered to send down there to help them, to train them, or to act as temporary staff in this process? How many people have you offered them, full-time equivalents?
We have 5 dedicated people down there. We don't do that with any other grantee. We put 5 people down there who are there all the time, working nonstop, 100% on Puerto Rico. We've had multiple people from my office, my staff, go down there on a routine basis. I've sent my own personal staff down there because they're IT experts, and they were disaster recovery experts from Houston who have walked them through the DRGR process and trained them. We've had multiple trainings with them. We've provided millions of dollars in technical assistance to them. We want them to succeed. We are pouring assets into Puerto Rico.
You're doubling your staff. I think you have ample resources to continue to help them.
We're ramping up. We got down to 25 people, unfortunately, and and my career staff is fantastic, but many of them are multitasking. The same person who writes the Federal Register notice has to put down the pen and jump on a plane and go monitor in West Virginia. So, thankfully to Congress, you've given us money and an appropriation to increase our staff. We're in the process of more than doubling our staff, but we're going to have some growing pains, and it takes a long time. You don't just put somebody on the job and they're a DRGR, a CDBG expert. It takes a while, and it may even take a year.
One question that hasn't been asked, so when will the notice be put out?
We anticipate that it'll be very soon. I don't want to commit to a specific date, but we're working. It's one of our top priorities is getting that Puerto Rican notice out.
You're 5 weeks beyond the statutory deadline. It's soon, but you can't share with us what that timetable will mean, because the reasons you didn't meet the deadline, those still exist, right? There still were, if you released the notice in December, there still were 3 governors in a short period of time. There still were other issues that you raised.
Yeah, I think with respect, with respect to talking about the governors and the issues that were happening in July and August, it was an attempt to explain why we missed the September 4 deadline. It was not out of disrespect for Congress or for this committee. That was not it at all. We just felt that we had to do something to protect the funds. Obviously, hopefully things will continue to be stable there. We continue to have a great working relationship with Vivienda, and we will work really hard. I assure you, we will work really hard. Sorry.
It doesn't feel like you're treating United States citizens in Puerto Rico the same as you would treat disaster recipients in other states. Can you tell us an update on the selection process for this financial monitor that you've indicated and that press release went out? Will they be the point person on this? What will their staff be? How will they monitor these assignments?
Yeah, so the federal financial monitor that was announced by the Secretary in early August is designed to be the point person in Puerto Rico overseeing the flow of funds. It's intended to be a single point of contact, so it would be easier for Vivienda to work with us. The primary purpose is to review and monitor and oversee the flow of funds throughout the whole process. What our group did over the last 7 or 8 months was put together a complex monitoring plan for the first time, and we hope to get that implemented with the Federal Financial Monitor. We have somebody identified. We hope to announce them soon. We're going through the hiring process that is a little bit cumbersome with government. The person is well-respected. He knows HUD. He knows the program. He's also a CPA by trade, not by trade, but he has a CPA license. I guess it's acting at this point. We have an org chart in place. We think it's going to be a team of 10 to 15 people.
Does the individual have background working in Puerto Rico?
Time of the gentleman's expired. Please finish your sentence and we'll.
They will be reside in Puerto Rico, and then we also have an org chart built out that will have deputies. We have deputy people that we're reviewing. So I think this will be a good process for us.
Thank you. Ms. Lawrence?
Yes, thank you. Congress provided $15 million for technical assistance for CDBG DR grantees. These funds were intended to develop the staffing plans, procurement practices, and financial controls. Corporate Facts is a company from my home state of Michigan, has been involved in both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands for technical assistant teams. How much of the $15 million has the department spent?
I'm not aware of the exact number, but I'm happy to provide that to you in a subsequent correspondence, ma'am.
Are you aware of the activities they perform with the funding?
I know that we provide a lot of technical assistance to Puerto Rico in a lot of different areas. They also have their own consultants that they pay for out of some of their funds, their admin funds. They're receiving a lot of help, and they're very open to receiving help. They're very helpful in terms of meeting with us and working with us. So we will spend whatever we need to spend in technical assistance to make sure that they get
Your
what they need.
technical assistants, are your monitors speaking Spanish?
Yes, we have a dedicated group down there, all Spanish speaking.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So the U.S. Virgin Islands mitigation notice was issued separately and after the other guarantees were already noticed. As we've heard, Puerto Rico's notice has not been issued.
That's correct.
Given the severity of the damage to these islands, why is HUD appearing to ignore their needs? We're talking about this, sitting in this room with air conditioning, heating, lights, and we know that the damage that we're talking about and the need of the people in Puerto Rico is real. Why are you ignoring their needs?
We're not ignoring Puerto Rico's needs. We're providing their needs through this initial allocation of $1.5 billion. They have a lot of money that 1.5, like I said, that can take up to a year and a half to 2 years to spend. And just to show you how difficult it is to spend that much money, they've only spent less than 1%. Now, that'll increase as they start to put more and more money into rebuilding housing, and we want them to speed their spending. We want them to hurry up and get that done. They're responsible for, but they have enough money for unmet need. The mitigation that you refer to, that's for long-term. We really
Right.
want transformative projects, and I think that's what the committee anticipated when you proposed that legislation. You want something that's going to help them 8 years, 9 years, 10 years down the road.
Mr. Wall, there is a perception, and based on some of the things you're saying there is a pattern of neglect for our U.S. territories, common during this administration. What message does this send to the American citizens living in Puerto Rico about their value to the federal government? And this is a common concern and takeaway from lack of action of this administration. How do you respond to that?
We are very committed to our fellow citizens in Puerto Rico and to the U.S. Virgin Islands. We are working very hard and diligently to get them all of the money that they were due, and we'd get them their money. What we do want to do, obviously, though, is make sure that it's spent on the people of Puerto Rico, the people who are most in need. And we feel that we have a hard, delicate balance where, of course, we have to get money out the door. But separate and apart from that, we also have an obligation to protect taxpayer funds, and we're trying to strike that balance. Right now, Puerto Rico has the $1.5 billion. We're closely monitoring that, making sure that they have enough for unmet need. We will get them additional funds, and eventually we will get them hopefully very soon we'll get them that mitigation funding as well.
I just want you to know that we have concerns about corruption in all levels of our government. It does not stop our government from working. If we went through the current scenario we have now, should we not fund this current administration because of the perception? No. We have to fund and take care of our responsibilities. And I'm very concerned that in this scenario, we're not doing our job and we're using it as an excuse.
We agree that the corruption's a concern everywhere, not just Puerto Rico, and certainly
Yes.
wouldn't be singling out Puerto Rico. But at the same time, Puerto Rico is a high-risk grantee. If for nothing else, then they have $20 billion, which is literally 26% of all the money that's been appropriated for disaster recovery since 2001. It's a huge amount of money.
They're not just sitting there asking for it, they need it.
Well, yeah, they do.
Based on the situation of the
Sure.
weather.
And we'll make sure that they have the money they need for their unmet
Thank you.
need.
I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Watson-Coleman?
Thank you. Does HUD have the authority to delay the notices, or are you required by law to put these notices out at a certain point in time?
I don't believe there's any statutory requirement unless it's in the appropriation bill itself.
So is it in the appropriation bill? So then you violated the appropriations bill.
Well, I think what the concern was with respect to the.
I don't want to hear it. Who do you report to directly?
I report to the deputy secretary.
Who do you report to directly?
Deputy Secretary.
And so the deputy secretary reports directly to Ben Carson, the secretary?
That's correct.
Okay, so you're pretty high up not to understand this memo that went from the Inspector General, Ray Oliver Davis, to Secretary Ben Carson. It's incomprehensible that you don't know about this. This is the letter that Ms. Torres mentioned, and that you said, I don't know anything about lying, so I don't know if I can answer the question. So I suggest you go back and talk to the deputy secretary and then perhaps the secretary if that's necessary.
What I said, ma'am, is I'm not aware of anybody at HUD saying that the reason that we didn't meet the September 4 deadline is because the IG told us not to meet the deadline. I'm unaware of anybody saying that. We made that decision based on a number of factors, including what we thought was an impending IG audit, but not just for that reason.
You've been talking around in a circle since I've been here, and I haven't been here the whole time. So you use a lot of words and say very little. So I'm just going to ask some questions that I need yes or no. $1.5 billion has been released. Is that a yes or no?
It's been obligated, correct?
It's obligated, not released. In order to spend it, do they have to give you a plan, and does Puerto Rico have to give you a plan, HUD a plan, and then get permission?
No, they have access to that 1.5 on a line of credit. They've already submitted with respect to the 1.5. They've already submitted an action plan, so we have their spending plan.
Can they spend it? Can they just go ahead on and spend it then? Have you approved $1.5 billion worth of expenditures?
As long as they spend it on things that are in the action plan, yes. So they submit, the action plan's a spending plan.
So can they just go, all right, all right. So this money is to be used to do what? Build homes, build sewers, build infrastructures. If they do anything that's on that list, you don't get involved. They just go hire somebody, pay them to get it done.
Yeah, what we do at that point is just monitor and make sure that they're following their own procedures and that the
Tell
money's
me why
accounted
they've
for.
only spent 1% of this money right now.
It takes a long time. We're long-term recovery. FEMA, just to explain, FEMA and SBA come in and they do a lot of the initial work to get people back to where they were before the storm. So they restore power. They do that sort of thing. What we try to do is
Yeah, we don't talk
rebuild.
about corruption. We could talk about that phase as it relates to Puerto Rico. And then Puerto Rico has gotten a black eye from the United States of America behind stuff that it had no control over. This is just absurd. This is absurd to me that Puerto Rico still has such a tremendous need for fundamental things like a decent house, some plumbing, some sewers, some access to drinking water, a telephone connection, or whatever. And we're sitting here having this silly conversation at this stage about how we can get you to get beyond your convoluted processes and so-called accountabilities as it relates to Puerto Rico that stands smack dab in the middle of our face, needing help. And while we can do these other things that this administration is doing without any kind of accountability, you all need to get the work done. You need to get the resources to Puerto Rico. You need to get the resources to the Virgin Islands. It does not escape me that these are black and brown islands. It does not escape me in this administration that what I see to be a disparities in the way they're being treated and the accountabilities that they're being duplicatively required and dependent upon impacts black and brown and poor people. So as far as I'm concerned, you all aren't doing your job, and you need to do your job. I don't care if you hire 10 more, no more, or if you stay or go. I yield back.
Well, again, ma'am, the Virgin Islands has hundreds of millions of dollars available to them for spending. Again, they've spent only a fraction of it. It's not atypical. We will start to see higher spend, but Puerto Rico has money for unmet need, and the Virgin Islands has money for unmet need.
Let us hope that they don't have to experience another devastating storm, either place. Let us hope that. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I'd like to ask some questions, many of which pick up from the earlier discussion. I'd appreciate just as quick an answer as you can manage, if would appreciate that. Sure. It bothered me to see you not question the premise. I think in Mr. Womack's question, it came up again with Ms. Clark. You seem to not be questioning the premise that money would, quote, flow out right after this notice was issued. Why didn't you clarify that, in fact, no money would flow out after the notice was issued?
If I'd said that, it was inarticulate, I apologize. There's a process. So the notice is followed by the action plan, which is followed by the grant agreement, and then the money's committed. It's in a line of credit and then available to the grantee to spend pursuant to the spending plan or the action plan.
That's
so
right.
if I misstated, I apologize. It was inartful.
All right, thank you. All right, and then you treated the interdependence of this process. You just now made clear. I was listening carefully. You now made clear this is a sequential process.
It is a sequential process.
So it's interdependent in that sense. But these are checkpoints. These are points at which the concerns you've expressed all afternoon could be acted on. True? Yeah. That's the action plan and then the grant agreement.
So what we've tried to build out the process a little bit. We were trying to go more of the belts and suspenders approach. For example, one of the things we've worked very hard on, we had a joint committee made up of the IG, OGC, a number of our different offices to try to enhance our grant agreement. The grant agreement we were using was literally a 2-pager that was adequate for CDBG, much smaller amounts in a formula program. We wanted something that was more wholesome and robust that would help protect the money, so we built that out. And the new process, or the belts and suspenders part of it, is to try to make them interdependent so that we have conditions set out in the notice that we then ask them to address in the action plan that we would then include in the grant agreement, so there's no surprises and nobody's wondering.
Well, actually, that sounds like quite a good idea, but it also sounds like it reinforces my initial point that the notice is the notice and that there are subsequent checkpoints. Okay, and you seem to be affirming, and I'll just ask you to confirm this, you seem to be confirming that that at no point has there been an indication from, we'll of course hear from the IG, but no point has there been an indication that anything in that capacity review would prevent the issuing of a mitigation notice. Is that right?
There were some things in the capacity audit that were troubling to us around procurement and around oversight.
I'm not asking whether they were troubling. I realize that the capacity review will have its findings. Right. I'm asking if there's anything there that would suggest that the law should be violated and the mitigation notice not issued.
It wasn't at one particular event. It wasn't just the IG report. It was multiple events and multiple things that were happening. And if I could just say in our defense, this was happening in August. There was a September 4 deadline. I agree that it was an inopportune time for all of this to be happening, but it was sort of in our face at the time. And that's as an explanation for missing the September 4 deadline. It was no disrespect. We just felt that we had a difficult choice given everything that was going on. But we're working really hard right now to get that mitigation notice out. It's our top priority, one of our top priorities. So.
Glad to hear that. We knew nothing of these difficulties through August, by the way.
And I'm sorry if the communications was poor, and that would be on us.
All right, finally, and I'll do this quickly, but I just sense an inconsistency here, and I want you to straighten it out. You immediately fastened on the slow spending. You criticized Puerto Rico for slow spending in the money they already have access to. That suggests it should be faster, right? But then you suggest there are all kinds of grave problems that won't even let you issue a mitigation notice for this later tranche of funding. So should they or should they not be allowed to draw down that $1.5 billion if these programs are so disabling? And by the way, they have drawn down $1.5 million. Have there been any disabling difficulties with respect to that $1.5 million that would suggest the kind of dire picture you've painted this afternoon?
Well, I hope I wasn't painting a dire picture, because I think that we will continue to work with Puerto Rico in getting these issues resolved. But with respect to the IG report, there were some concerns around procurements that have happened and oversight. So that's sort of right in the heartland, I think, with what Irv is looking at and concerned about.
You know, on the $1.5 million, we do have 4 people down there monitoring the disbursements and working with them. And the $1.5 billion that they have and the money they're spending is building out their infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier. As that gets built out, we'll improve our monitoring process to look at the complete flow of funds. But they have money to get. I don't think we were criticizing their expenditure of only $1.5 million. That's just a natural flow in some of these disasters. So I don't think we were criticizing that. But we do have people down there monitoring the disbursements as they go. And Vivienda, I want to stress, they're good people. We have a good collaborative relationship with them. They take our advice, and there's not issues with the Vivienda that we see at this point. But that doesn't mean there's not the whole risk structure of the island itself or the Commonwealth is what we focused on.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to put something on the line which I said at the beginning, which is, to me, missing that deadline is troubling. You've heard that already. But I think it's also important that we are very careful. There's nothing that I have ever heard that shows that race has anything to do with any decision here. Those are, I think we got to be careful to throw those things around, because you cheapen then when racism does take place. So I just want to be very clear that I've seen nothing that shows, there's not one iota of fact that shows that there's anything having to do with race that has had anything to do with any of the decisions that you have made, and clearly that Secretary Carson has made. That's just, and if somebody could show that to me, I'd like to see it. Because again, it cheapens the issue when you throw racism out there for political reasons, because racism does exist, but it cheapens it when you just throw it out there. And I have not seen one fact that shows that that was a decision. I just wanted to put that for the record. Mr. Chairman, let me ask a question.
Thank you for that.
And again, I'm troubled by missing that deadline. I really am. If that deadline would have not been missed, would more than has already been spent by Puerto Rico potentially would have been spent?
I'm sorry. I'm not sure I followed.
Well, he's saying if the Federal Register notice was filed, would they have spent any more money? And the answer is no.
Why not?
Because it's a process, as the chairman indicated. They are doing what they're doing in spending the 1.5, get their infrastructure in place. The Federal Register would give them a little more of the ground rules on the ultimate grant agreement. But they're working towards that. They know what the the goals of the unmet needs are and the mitigation that maybe David could speak to more, but it wouldn't have accelerated the 1.5 spending.
That's the thing. Our priority is always to get money to the grantees for unmet need. And so with respect to the entire class of 2017, they all have money for the foreseeable future to spend on unmet need. That's what we're constantly looking at to make sure that they have that. With respect to the mitigation funding, yeah, it's important to get that notice out so that the process can start. But that, as I said a couple times earlier, that's really long-term. We want them to do a lot of planning around that. We want them to take their time, and I think this committee had anticipated really transformative, large projects that are going to have a lot of meaning 10 years from now.
Clearly, it's understandable why, and you hear it, and we hear it, and our constituents, it's understandable why we want those that deserve it to get the relief as soon as possible. And yet, obviously, I would tell you, that, and you heard it from Mr. Womack, we want to make sure that the taxpayer money is protected. That's a balance, right? That has to be reached. If we had authorization, if an authorization bill took place, would it help potentially in getting the money out faster? Would it potentially help in making sure that there is less potential for waste and fraud and abuse? What are the advantages, potential advantages, in this balance? Because we want the money out yesterday or, you know, the day after the storm, right?
Right.
But we also need to make sure that it's protected because it's hard-earned taxpayer money. So what would that authorization help, and tell us why, and what's the benefit if in those two aspects, those specific aspects?
Right. I think it definitely has the potential to increase the speed of program delivery. As the Secretary has said before, you know, maybe we could start on second base if we had the codification. Again, I think it has to be done correctly. You know, HUD has to tailor its approach to individual events and states. So one of the key requirements for any codification would be that it would include waiver and alternative requirements to give us the flexibility we need to react to different events, different types of disasters, and the different grantees that we get, whether it be California, Texas, or Florida. So I think it could speed the process. It probably could help with respect to fraud, waste, and abuse because the rules would be very clear for everybody, and we could have processes in place already as opposed to building from scratch as we had to do with certain grantees.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Time's up.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe it's a good thing this hearing is coming to a close because, frankly, if it's confusing to many of us here, I think and I hope you can straighten us out. Mr. Dennis, in your financial evaluation of Puerto Rico, you have advocated improving its financial controls. However, HUD has already certified that the territory's financial controls are adequate. So my first question, and maybe I'll just ask both together, and I know this hearing is coming to a close. Number one, I'd be interested in what has changed your view since the agency's assessment. Number two, we've seen other agencies respond to Puerto Rico's political situation. For example, FEMA changed drawdown requirements after the gubernatorial change. After conducting audits of Puerto Rico's expenditures, FEMA lifted those requirements and allowed Puerto Rico to return to normal spending. So maybe you can just answer this. Has HUD modified the conditions under which Puerto Rico can draw down existing funds?
So their existing obligated funds is that $1.5 billion. They're proceeding in spending that money pursuant to the action plan that the Secretary approved, and so they have that money is available to them in a line of credit. We haven't changed the rules on that. They're able to access that money as long as it fits within the spending plan that they have.
Have you been to Puerto Rico?
I have, yes.
How many times?
I've been there one time since I've been in this particular role, but Our deputy secretary's been there, our CFO has been there twice. We've had multiple career staff down there. We have a Department Enforcement Center person down there now. We have a dedicated staff of 5 people down there who we're in touch with every day. So we spent a lot of resources down in Puerto Rico.
That I know. Are you getting the work done?
We are, and, we have a good team down there. They work very collaboratively with Vivienda. We have an excellent relationship and a good partnership, and, we want to keep that going.
Maybe that's a good way to conclude this hearing, Mr. Chairman, because I was there at the very beginning, and the need was extraordinary.
Yeah.
And the fact that it took so long for this money to even been released, and there were people such as Mr. Mulvaney and others who didn't think the money should be released, but I don't want to go over that drama. So I'm glad you're concluding now. I hope there's good oversight. I don't understand why money is being held up when HUD certified that the territory's financial controls are adequate. So I'd be interested, Mr. Chairman, in getting progress reports and what actually is happening there, because I think you want to see progress, I want to see progress, and I'm very concerned that we're getting caught up in bureaucratic red tape. So good luck. Thank you for coming. I hope that you're not only spending the money, but the oversight is keen and adequate, so we know that all the damage is being repaired as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam.
Thank you. Mr. Aguilar?
If I could ask you about the Virgin Islands. It's been, correct me if I'm wrong, March 1 of this year, so 7 months since HUD approved the Virgin Islands Action Plan. Is that right?
I believe that's correct, yeah.
However, HUD has not entered into a grant agreement with the government of the Virgin Islands to allow for the disbursement of the funds. Is that also correct?
That's correct. We're in the process of completing that grant agreement now to give them access to additional funds, yes.
The first allotment of disaster recovery funds took 72 days from action plan to execution of the grant agreement. This was $242 million in disaster recovery from the 2017 supplemental. The second portion of the disaster recovery funds is $779 million and was appropriated in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. I think it goes without saying the Virgin Islands relies on this money for key projects and port infrastructure, money for elderly and disabled, workforce development. When will the grant agreement for the second apportionment of unmet needs be available?
So with respect, just so you know, with respect to the first tranche, that money is already obligated. That's in their line of credit, and they're able to draw down on that now.
Sure, the one that took 72 days?
One that was very quick, yeah. Because
Yeah,
again,
yeah.
our priority is
I guess what I'm
typically on
asking-
unmet need, and we try to get folks the money they need for unmet need.
Why is it taking 7 months for the second tranche then?
Well, the couple things happened. I think we tried to take a harder look at our grant agreements. Our prior grant agreements were insufficient. They were 2-pagers for the CDBG program, so we had a panel that we put together to try to make our grant agreements more effective and more comprehensive. And so we have that now. What we have to do is we're doing it based on objective risk, the risk that a particular grantee presents to us. Virgin Islands is completely separate from Puerto Rico. It has nothing to do with Puerto Rico.
I understand that. Thank you for the lesson.
I wasn't trying to be condescending. I really wasn't. I know that they are sensitive about being lumped in. That was all I meant, but I wasn't trying to imply otherwise. But, they have capacity issues. For example, with respect to their certifications, they indicated that they would have X amount of staff, and they've had trouble, making that happen. So we're trying to work with them as well. We do anticipate having a grant agreement out to them soon, and at that point, that money will be obligated, and they'd be able to spend it.
More thorough is fine, more comprehensive is fine. 72 days to 7 months, not helpful, really not. We've got, there's folks who need help, and that's difficult. So will HUD impose stricter conditions for state grantees through the Bipartisan Budget Act funding? You said more thorough, more comprehensive, different agreement, go away from a 2-pager. So
Right.
What changes in the responsibilities that they will have?
Well, again, we're going to try to objectively address risk in future grant agreements regardless of who the state is. We want it to be objective, and we want it to be based, a lot of times it would be based on how they've performed with other grant programs, for example, CDBG, whether they've had issues or not. And it's also going to be based on the amount of money, because the more money, the more risk.
Back to this issue with the IG, we understand that there's a little bit of a disagreement on the codification piece, but if HUD believed that it was the prerogative of Congress to codify the program, why didn't you include it in the legislative proposals for fiscal year FY20 for budget justifications?
I'm not sure that I think that where we are is that we would be open. We think that could be some potential advantages to codification, and we'd be obviously open to a dialogue on that in terms of what that would look like. And but the key, I think, is that we do it in a correct way. I mean, what the appropriators give us now, which is very helpful, is the waiver and alternative requirement authority, which helps us to be flexible and nimble, which I think is what the committee wants. And so any kind of codification to be done correctly would have to include that. And obviously we want to work with you to making that happen.
Yeah, why not include that in your legislative proposals to start the dialogue if that was something that you thought would be helpful?
I'm happy to take that back to others and propose that.
I'm not asking you to propose it. I'm just saying, like, if you wanted to kickstart the dialogue, it seems like that would have been the appropriate time to say, hey, Congress, maybe it'll work better if we, codify this, even though the IG thinks that you have the authority. So I just offer that to you. Hopefully, is something we can work through as you're looking toward FY21 future justification. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. As we prepare to close the hearing, I do have another question. In fact, an important question about the pending appointment of a federal financial monitor to oversee Puerto Rico. But before I turn to that, I want to just reiterate that this committee obviously takes very seriously the failure to meet the statutory requirement that the notice be issued. That's why we're having this hearing, and that's why you've heard what you've heard today expressed in various ways. I'm glad to hear that the notice is in process, and I welcome any prediction as to how soon we're going to see it. But we're going to hear from the IG next, and what we're going to hear from the IG, I believe, is that there's nothing in that office's review that would justify holding up this notice. And we've heard from you, I believe, today that that the notice would not equate to the release of funds, and so forth. So therefore, and that there are multiple checkpoints at which abuses can be prevented and safeguards can be exercised, and so that there's no real reason, in terms of whatever problems Puerto Rico may have, for the notice to be the choke point. I think that is what we've concluded. It's what I've concluded from today's hearing, and so I'm unmoved in my conclusion that this was a serious mistake on the department's part to not meet the statutory deadline for the issuance of that notice. And we of course welcome the news that the work is underway on this notice, and we expect it to be promptly issued. Now, the announcement about the federal financial monitor, that's a separate but related matter. It was announced on August 2nd, I believe, and the idea of the monitor was to oversee the disbursement of disaster recovery funds to Puerto Rico. Press release was interesting that Secretary Carson issued. Here's what he said. He said it was the result of the Puerto Rican government's, quote, alleged corruption, fiscal irregularities, and mismanagement, end of quote. Now, HUD's conducted many reviews and site visits of Puerto Rico's CDBG DR programs. Did any of those reviews ever find, quote, corruption, fiscal irregularities, and mismanagement at Puerto Rico's Department of Housing?
I don't know I haven't seen all of prior IG reports, so I don't know the answer to that question. But I don't know if his comment was specific to Vivienda. I think it might have been to the Commonwealth in general.
Well,
I think that's correct. I
the
don't,
Secretary's making pronouncements of that sort, accusations of that sort. Wouldn't it behoove him to be specific? Or maybe
Well-
even to offer a citation or two?
But again, I'm of the strong view that if you're think of a company, if you're giving money to the subsidiary, you want to make sure the parent company's in good financial health with good controls.
Well, nobody's going to dispute that. The question is, have HUD's own reviews ever found those defects to be present? I think the answer is no. What's the role for this financial monitor for Puerto Rico? When is the monitor going to be appointed?
The monitor is going to be appointed relatively quickly, I would say over the next month or two. Like I mentioned, we have a candidate going through the hiring practice of the government, which takes a while. The role of the monitor is to oversee the flow of funds to make sure that there are controls in place, not only at the grantee, but at the sub-grantee, sub-recipient, is to make sure that procurement practices are in place, the conflict controls are in place, making sure invoices that are getting paid to the right people, the right time, for the right services. It's a program that I put together or the CFO shop put together a audit program for monitoring. The Federal Financial Monitor will use that as a starting point. Like I mentioned earlier, there'll be deputy financial monitors, team, we're anticipating 10 to 15 people. They'll be on site, and the role is to make sure that we're looking at the controls in place for the complete flow of funds, not just the flow of funds at the grantee level.
So it's an elaborate arrangement, it sounds.
And I should also say that this isn't specific to Puerto Rico. This was built from bringing my private sector thinking in, that this is probably a program that we're going to roll out for all of DR. It's just that we're starting with Puerto Rico because it's new, it's big, and for the risk areas that we identified earlier. And they're starting with a fresh sheet of paper, so we have the ability to influence it.
Well, but the fact is, you've never appointed such a monitor to any other CDBG DR grantee, true?
I think there may have been at some point a receiver, but I'm not 100% sure about that. This is a new role, absolutely. And so it's going to be a little bit of growing pains as we sort of figure out the best way for it to work, but we feel that we have a very good candidate identified. And the other thing, too, is the Federal Financial Monitor can also help coordinate with the other federal agencies down there, and as well as with the Inspector General, because what we don't want to do is overburden the people at Vivienda by sending group after group down there to do monitoring after monitoring and get in their way, because sometimes they ask us not to go because they need to work.
Well, our time's expiring, but I do want to ask one more question, and that has to do with what might be conditioned in terms of the appointment of this monitor. How might it condition the release of funds? Do you expect the release of CDBG DR funds to be delayed until the monitor is appointed?
No, we don't, because the money can get obligated, as you know, and it takes. And I wasn't being critical of Puerto Rico. I wasn't calling them a slow spender. I mean, it takes a long time to spend that money. So the monitor will be in place as most of the money is being spent. So we don't have to worry. We have plenty of folks down there now to handle the money, the expenditures now.
Sounds like a hands-on assignment. Can we be assured that the monitor you're going to appoint will speak Spanish?
Well, at a minimum, they'll have multiple staff people that speak Spanish. We already have 5 people down there now who all speak Spanish, but it's tough to find somebody who has all of the skill set of what we're looking for with the monitor. I mean, we were looking for someone who knows HUD, knows our programs, has auditing and accounting background, perhaps has legal background. So it's a difficult person to find, and we're never going to find the perfect person, but we're going to give him as much.
Assignment of this delicacy, this difficulty, I would say Spanish fluency should be high on that list of qualifications.
The deputy of the financial monitor we have in place does speak Spanish.
Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Mr. Chairman, by the way, I just would remind the chairman that the chairman's time has never expired.
I've never gone over 2.5 minutes, Mr. Ranking Member,
But, Mr. Chairman, if you do, I'm not going to be complaining. I just want to get it
I'll
out.
give you equivalent to privilege, all right?
Thank you, Mr.
All right,
Chairman.
good.
But by the way, no, to Mr. Aguilar's point, I think it is important, and you mentioned the issue about flexibility, right? And I'm talking about the codification process. It is important that obviously this subcommittee, and I know the staff is in touch, but I think it's very important, Mr. Chairman, that we are very vigilant on any codification bill going out there and making sure that it's something that will not hinder our ability to do what has to be done. And so I just, again, want to just encourage all of us, and obviously the chairman and the staff to be very vigilant on that as well. And lastly, if I may, Mr. Chairman, really kind of almost a point of personal privilege. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, you, as well as the full committee chairwoman, always, you have aggressive questions. But you're always pursuing the facts. And I think this subcommittee has always been very good at not getting in all of the noise out there, regardless of the merits of whatever the noise is. And I think the leadership of this subcommittee has an obligation to do that. And I will tell you, Mr. Chairman, I'm exceedingly proud that you always have. And so, not that you're not aggressive, but as chairman or as members of this subcommittee of Congress, we have an obligation to be aggressive. We have an obligation to be upset about missing deadlines. But I just want to thank you for while being aggressive, doing it in a way that keeps this subcommittee from getting politicized, which is what has made this subcommittee different, and I am very grateful to your leadership, Mr. Chairman.
I really appreciate those comments, my friend, and I do think it's a standard you set and that I hope that the subcommittee as a whole can uphold. With that, I thank our witnesses, and you get the picture in terms of our concerns, and I would hope the reasoning behind all the questions you've been asked, and you also have a good sense of our expectations, and so we look forward to continuing to work with you and the department.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we will recess for just a few minutes. We want to bring the next panel forward, and we're already running quite late, so we will resume very quickly. So committee will come to order for the second panel, which consists of one distinguished witness, whom we're glad to welcome today, Mr. Jeremy Kirkland. He's the counsel to the HUD Inspector General. Mr. Kirkland, we appreciate your appearing before us today. You're recognized for 5 minutes of opening remarks. Your full statement will be entered into the record.
Good afternoon, Chairman Price, Ranking Member Diaz-Balart, members of the subcommittee and staff. I am Jeremy Kirkland, Counsel to the Inspector General at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is a pleasure to be here with you today to discuss our work in disaster recovery oversight. I could not be more proud of our staff, their work, and their accomplishments in this important area. Since 2002, we have issued 124 audits, 7 evaluations, and have opened more than 600 investigations related to disaster oversight. Throughout our work, we have noticed common themes, including the need for codification, the need for model programs that provide clear expectations for strong internal controls, and the need for accountability for expenditures of funds at late stages in the process. We believe the CDBG-DR's mission is an important one. It's so important that we believe it should be codified into its own program within HUD. In fact, multiple grantees involved in the recovery efforts in these most recent disasters have informed us they believe codification can help. We have all heard concerns about how long it takes CDBG-DR funds to get out to those in need. The process is lengthy and confusing for everyone involved. Currently, there are 76 active Federal Register notices dating all the way back to 9/11 that grantees must navigate to determine how to design and implement their local programs. Often, primary grantees are new or inexperienced, further complicating an already cumbersome process. We strongly recommend a clear and permanent framework for this program. We believe it will reduce the time between appropriation and disbursement and will provide consistency surrounding the requirements of the CDBG-DR program, upon which grantees and the public can rely. We also hope any permanent authorization will consider identifying core program activities more clearly. There is a steep learning curve for grantees, and adoptable core functions would mitigate the delay and possible mistakes in having each new grantee create its own disaster program. We believe that by codifying just the requirements for a grantee action plan, we could trim 2 to 4 months off of this lengthy process. Our work has continued to highlight that CDBG-DR can and should provide a clear blueprint for all grantees to follow to meet expected strong internal controls. Any grantee program should include solid internal policies, strong monitoring, clear understanding of reporting responsibilities, good financial management policies, sufficient information systems that ensure accurate and timely reporting of expenses in HUD systems, clear conflict of interest policies and training for all employees. Another concern we have noticed is the expenditure of funds on projects that occur late in the funding process, in some cases 5 or more years after the disaster occurred. Examples of this include sewer and infrastructure development on land where homes are never built, among many others. We recently had the pleasure of briefing your staff on our audit report of Puerto Rico's Department of Housing, known as Vivienda, which we are currently finalizing. The objective of the review was to determine whether Vivienda had the capacity to administer its CDBG-DR grants in accordance with applicable regulations and requirements. We found that they should improve financial controls. They should develop processes to prevent duplication of benefits. They should improve procurement controls, and they should continue to increase staffing. These challenges exist because Vivienda is a newly appointed grantee with no experience administering CDBG-DR funds. As part of our oversight work, I have personally visited Puerto Rico and witnessed the ongoing recovery efforts. This is a long-term process that requires a long-term commitment by all, including HUD OIG. I thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that testimony, and we'll take a note of it in several respects. What I want to do is, in our time today, is to focus on the question of the mitigation notice, which was the subject of the last hearing, and which, in various ways, the IG, your office, has been cited. HUD did fail to comply with the law. That much no one disputes. They didn't issue the mitigation notice for Puerto Rico by September 4th. We have heard from HUD on several occasions that the reason for the mitigation notice not being issued is related to serious, not just serious questions about Puerto Rico's conduct and capacity, but serious findings in the IG's capacity review. So that's what I want to ask you quite directly. At any point, has your office told or indicated to HUD that there were grave findings in the capacity review that would prevent them from issuing a mitigation notice?
No, Mr. Chairman.
The answer is no. Now, about that capacity review, you've now finished the review. The draft findings have been sent to HUD, as I understand, and to the grantee for comment. Could you, you've already begun to discuss some of those findings in your statement. But let me ask you, you heard the quote I read from Secretary Carson alleging, quote, corruption, fiscal irregularities, and mismanagement on the part of Puerto Rico. Did your review encounter anything that would fit that description?
No, sir.
Are any of your findings out of the ordinary for a CDBG-DR grantee?
The findings that we found are typical findings that we would find with a new grantee. Obviously, financial controls, procurement controls, the need for data matching agreements to be renewed, staffing concerns. Those are pretty typical that we would find. And one thing to note, obviously, it is still a draft report. Vivienda and the department both get an opportunity to clarify anything as part of the process. We do await the grantee's comments, and it could adjust some of the findings that we found once Vivienda provides us. They could provide us details that that update the information that we have, and so some of those findings could, in the interim, improve.
I wonder what you'd say about the kind of positive support HUD should be providing grantees. What do you think HUD could do to ensure that grantees succeed rather than fail, and in particular that they begin the disaster grant on a sound financial footing? Has HUD taken any steps internally to provide better guidance, technical assistance to grantees to avoid problems before they develop?
We do understand that HUD is engaged with all grantees, attempting to provide guidance. We have been told that they have been meeting with Vivienda to provide guidance on technical issues. One of the concerns that we have is there is no standard expectation. That's why we have so strongly argued for codification of a program, because we really should have a standard that all grantees should be held to. We should have a standard that should be the best practice and the best practice for any grantee. And unfortunately, HUD has relied on grantees to develop the road for themselves, and that creates problems in our mind for especially new grantees who are attempting to look and execute the best practices out there.
It is fair to assume that does create a challenge for new grantees, and so we do need clear, consistent standards and technical assistance in meeting those standards.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Jesvilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here, but more importantly, thanks for what you do. You know, in a July 2018 report, the IG suggested that even without, and correct me if I'm wrong, but even without a permanent authorization, HUD could actually codify through the the regulatory process. You know, and Mr. Chairman, that's actually an interesting idea. You know, so it doesn't necessarily require legislation. It could be codified by rule by HUD,
That is correct.
which, you know, is something that maybe we should also kind of think about because, again, you know, I don't know if that's better or worse. I think there are some pros and some cons, but it's just another interesting approach which I had not thought about. So I just wanted to throw that out there. We've seen estimates about mitigation, you know, from time to time, and, you know, how much a dollar spent on mitigation can save later on. You know, is it $1 now, $6 later? That's clearly one of the reasons that we, you know, worked hard to put that mitigation money in there. And so, but is there a way to kind of codify that and to make sure that mitigation programs actually are gonna be saving money as opposed to just feel good that, you know, we think are good, but eventually don't save money?
I certainly think with the focus on mitigation within the IG, we have talked about ensuring that we take a look at, is that mitigation money going to the right places, and looking at future savings associated with mitigation money that is going out, and we do intend to look at that from the IG's perspective.
And I think this may have been a better question for HUD, and I apologize, but you know, because it would seem to me that you could create performance measures. HUD could create performance measures to deal with, to making sure that we are getting a return on this mitigation money that's invested.
I certainly know there are measurements out there that are standards looked at from the return on investment on things like that. So I would assume that there would be ways to put that together.
Obviously, Puerto Rico's been a big part of the hearing today for obvious reasons, right? And I think the big reason, there's a unanimous understanding that you know, missing deadlines is not something that we take lightly. From HUD, not from you, because you haven't done that. But tell me a little bit about what unique challenges, you know, relatively, as far as a new grantee, such as Puerto Rico, faces in executing the CDBG-DR program, especially, you know, when you're dealing with a lot of money. What are some of those? Are there unique challenges when you're new versus, like, a state of Florida that unfortunately, by the way, and I say this truly, I wish we didn't have that much experience with these issues, but unfortunately Florida does. What are some of those challenges and some of the risks potentially for new grantees?
Well, you certainly have to start with you have to build all the infrastructure and the backbone that is going to support the recovery effort. Also, with any new grantee, there are new rules, new expectations. Many times, and this is the case for every new grantee that we've seen since dating back to 9/11, the money associated with that is provided through this disaster recovery is substantially more for, in many cases, you know, looking at the state of New York, their average went up from, I think it was 42 million to 400 million, or substantially more than that. So the circumstances are that everyone is having to absorb a higher expectation for every time they step into that role.
If I may, one more question, Mr. Chairman, if you'd allow me. So we heard a lot about, you know, the staffing issue of HUD. And so you're looking at now about, what, under 50 people to oversee the entire CDBG-DR portfolio. That's, you know, that's, what, $55 billion in grant activity? Which, and I know it's oversimplifying because that's not the way it works, but, you know, you're looking at about over $1 billion per employee. And that staff is also responsible for publishing guidance in the Federal Registry, establishing allocations, ensuring compliance, in some cases, potentially even traveling to places, right, and embedding. And so is the level of staffing in that office of, close to 50 adequate for managing this multi-billion-dollar portfolio? And, what, do they have the staffing and do they have the adequate skill to do that?
We have expressed concern on both of those points. We don't think they have the adequate staffing at this point in time. To the point of your question, to oversee over $1 billion worth of a portfolio. We have expressed concerns also. They don't carry out their oversight role, their monitoring roles, their technical advisory roles that they are mandated to do. So from a staffing perspective, we don't think they have the level of staffing that they should. And also looking at when these unprecedented disasters occur, it overwhelms every system, including CDBG DR systems. We also have other types of disasters, looking at wildfires, looking at earthquakes. Do they have the technical expertise to know how to deal with different types of disasters and what to look for and what to recommend? We don't think it's there yet. We have recommended that they work on that, however.
And Mr. Chairman, I reminded you that the chairman's time never expires, but I don't want you to remind me that the ranking member's does, so I will yield back.
Now we're even, right? All right, one further question, but it's an important one, and it draws on some information that you had, that your office had furnished earlier. I know you've faced difficulties accessing HUD emails in the course of carrying out your investigations. In an April 2019 briefing, the IG provided additional details about these challenges, and in one case was told by HUD that it would take about 6 to 12 months for the department to turn over emails relevant to the IG's investigation into HUD's treatment of Puerto Rico. We inserted language in the fiscal 2020 T-HUD bill to clarify that HUD shall not withhold documents or delay access to the Inspector General during investigations. Are you still facing these challenges? That's my basic question when it comes to accessing emails or interviewing witnesses during your investigations. And if so, have you relayed concerns directly to HUD management? Can you characterize their response?
Mr. Chairman, first of all, we want to express our appreciation to this committee, to the committee staff for your commitment to supporting our efforts as an Inspector General. We think through that effort, we were able to make some progress on emails and agency counsel in interviews concerns. We have been in discussions with the department on both of those issues. We can say initially after engagement with the committee and discussions with the department, the email production time improved. It got down to about 15 days that they were able to produce. One of the concerns, and this is a recent concern that has come about, several weeks ago, the department asked us in a latest request for about 2 weeks' worth of emails associated with an investigation. They asked us to provide search terms to help expedite production of those emails. We did provide those search terms late last week. We were told that it would help significantly expedite that process. We were told just yesterday, though, that the production is likely going to be probably the end of this month. We are frustrated by the fact.
Excuse me, I'm not understanding perfectly. These are emails that you have requested.
These are emails that we have requested from the department, and the department had gotten to where they were producing them within about 15 days.
Yes.
However, this latest request is about 2 months old. The department informed us that if we provided search terms, it would help expedite their production of those emails. We provided search terms just last week, and just yesterday we were told that it would take till the end of this month before they produce. these continue to delay our investigations. We don't feel that's timely production of emails, and they continue to hide behind a poorly scoped e-discovery contract that they run these emails through as a reason for the fact they can't produce them timely to us. But any delays in the production of that information is a delay in our ability to carry out our work, our investigations, and it's important to us that they understand we take that very seriously. We did attempt to accommodate them by providing them search terms. That's not something we were required to do, but we understood that that would help expedite the process. It is concerning that they continue to have these delays, whether it's for reasons of a poorly scoped contract or for other reasons. We are frustrated by that. As to agency counsel, we were able to reach agreement on with certain high-level agency officials. Agency counsel can sit outside the room to advise if issues come up associated with executive privilege, could advise the person being interviewed if issues come up. We reached that accommodation recently and have finally been able to move forward with our interviews associated with one of our investigations, but that did cause a 2 or 3 month delay in negotiating that. But we do have a path forward, we hope, on the agency counsel issue.
Well, it's important to have that path forward and to keep pressing on these matters and to have accountability from the department as to the reasonable requests you've made, and if there are reasons they should be modified or can't be met, then to give an explanation, an accountable explanation to you. So we appreciate your good work, and we expect that you'll keep us informed about these matters and any other impediments to your work that you encounter.
We certainly will.
Mr. Yesler?
No, Mr. Chairman, I just make sure that there's no light between the chairman and I on this. I mean, that's, you know, you have to be able to get timely whatever you need. And so, and I don't want to speak for the chairman, but I think I can in this, that if there's, well, if we need to be doing something to make sure that you can get what you need, I think the subcommittee will be very helpful. You have to be able to get timely information in order to get your investigations done.
And I want to stress on behalf of the Inspector General, great appreciation for the entire committee and your staffs on your commitment to ensuring that very fact. It is clear to us that you are all committed to that fact, and we have appreciated the dedicated time that you've put toward ensuring that we do get that access that we are entitled to.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your help with this important hearing we've explored today, your patience in waiting through a delayed proceeding, and we will we'll be in touch with you and your office about any follow-up that's required. Thank you very much, and the hearing is adjourned.